So welcome everyone to today's Advisor Today webinar. My name is Suzanne Carroll. I am with NAIFA. We are proud to produce the Advisor Today platform, which is inclusive of a print magazine to our members, a extremely wildly popular podcast that you'll probably hear. Carroll Golden has been one of our guests today, has been on, and we'd hope to have Dan Mangus in the future episode, as well as this webinar series and a full digital blog that we have over 78,000 subscribers. So if you're not subscribed, please do so. You can find all of our archives and all of our content and documents, et cetera, at at.naifa.org. And if you are not a member, I would encourage you to join us because you get to great access to people like Dan and Carol that we'll hear from in just a second, as well as, of course, you can do what all NAIFA members want to do, which is protect Main Street USA, their businesses and their clients' wealth. So think about doing that. You can join us at naifa.org/join. So with no further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Dan Mangus and Carroll Golden. I'm going to let Carol do the propers here for Dan, but both of these two people, wonderful people, have been a part of NAIFA now in a very compelling and impactful way for the last couple of years. So we're delighted to hear about a really exciting topic. And I would just say as a housekeeping item, while this is recorded, it will be available on demand at at.naifa.org. Also, if you do have a question, we're not going to take any questions during this actual interview style session, but if you do have one, feel free to drop that to advisortoday@naifa.org. I'll put that in the chat as well as we go, and I'll put in any useful documents or supplemental information and be able to reiterate anything that Carol and Dan's saying to make this a nice, so you don't have to take copious notes. So with no further ado, Carroll Golden, welcome. Carol's our Executive Director for all of our Centers of Excellence here at NAIFA. And Carol, I will let you take it away. And thank you both again for being here.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I just want to take a few minutes to tell everybody a little bit about Dan. Dan is unusual in as much as he started his first insurance company at the age of 18. Okay, so not all of us started and got right at it, but Dan did, because by 21, he went on to be the chairman of the Life Underwriter Training Council. Dan's been teaching about Medicare for many years and is often, teaching at universities. He's a keynote for national insurance conferences, and he is a contributor for the RICP designation, which is offered by the American College. In addition, Dan does articles. I can tell you that for LECP, the Limited and Extended Care Planning Center, we have tapped into Dan several times for articles. He also is a tremendous contributor on our LECP Advisory Council. Dan comes up with the most innovative and forward-thinking ideas about how to help our members become better and be accessible to the information that their clients may need. He also is a published author of a series of books called Talking Medicare. Dan's current position is as Vice President of Growth and Development with Senior Marketing Specialists, who have been a sponsor for the LECP Center from the very beginning, a founding sponsor, for which we're very grateful. And in his role, he helps agents and agencies build successful and stable businesses, as well as guide them through mergers and acquisitions. And, sometimes it's they're going to have someone in their current organization take over, or maybe it's going to be a family member, or maybe they'll be purchased through the Senior Market Specialist Career Division. I want to also mention that this is not the first time I've had the privilege of interviewing Dan. Our first interview, Dan, was September 3rd, 2019. So it just shows you that Dan is always willing to support NAIFA and their need to educate and familiarize our membership. So today, we're going to be talking about mergers and acquisitions, and they usually involve some sort of life change, whether it's retirement, whether it's someone wants to change the focus perhaps of their business. So obviously, these tend to be very emotional situations. And I think, Dan, we would like to start off by tapping in a little bit to what have you seen actually in terms of an emotional roller coaster that can happen? I think before we actually ask you to answer that, I just want to mention that in discussing mergers and acquisitions, Dan has divided this into 3 pillars for you. We'll first talk about the emotional aspects, then we'll move on to the organizational aspects, and we'll wrap up with the financial aspects. So, Dan, having done quite a few of these and having seen so much emotion, tell us a little bit about what kind of a range of emotions do people experience when they start into this process?
It's different for everybody what they're going through. So one is never exactly like the other. So you see a lot of individuals that experience surprisingly new emotions for themselves. And I think that one of the things that happens when you're starting to this, usually it is triggered by some kind of a health condition or change of life situation, or maybe a desire to retire, or maybe a desire to focus on a specific market that is different inside of your agency. There's a lot of different things that trigger people, but it usually starts out as a financial conversation and quickly moves to a situation where after they're in the middle of it, they realize that they're starting to feel feelings because their identity and everything that they've worked so hard for is so tied to that. One of the things about selling is it's a transfer of emotion.
Yeah.
And if an individual has vested so much emotion into the transaction every time that they meet with a client and all these different relationships that they have, then it's tied to their personal identity. And so as they start to move away from that and realize the reality of the transaction, then these emotions well up that can surprise an individual. And it's very good to kind of think about those ahead of time, because there's a lot of very loving reasons why a person needs to think about transition. And quite honestly, that transition needs to be thought about the minute you open your business, so that you're ready for that, because you're going to absolutely, unquestionably go through transition in your career. And all of us, since all of us are mortal, we know that things are going to happen to us. So eventually, like it or not, we are going to go through a transition, and our clients are going to eventually have someone else taking care of them. Sometimes we don't think about that, but they are going to at some point. And so we need to plan for that and think about that. But from an emotional standpoint, there's a lot of things that go into it. Another thing too, I'm sorry.
No,
I was just,
I was going to just ask you.
I'll just ramble on here, Carol. But I guess what I was going to say is that you have also, knowing that you're going into a transaction like that, a lot of things are going to come up. You have to kind of show your entire business to somebody who is going to be acquiring it. So because of that, we all are imperfect. And so we make mistakes. We don't have the best records sometimes. Sometimes we haven't taken care of a client like we should or something, from keeping up with the service records or something. Sometimes our operational systems aren't the best. And so you feel like that person is going to look at that, may judge you because of that. But I can tell you from going through a lot of acquisitions that as a buyer, you do not expect perfection when you go into a situation. So that's okay. That's completely okay. It's just reality. So accepting that and dealing with that kind of emotion is extremely important when it comes to acquisitions.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, considering, understandably, this is very emotional. What advice would you give our listeners in how to sort of deal with it? Do they bring it up, or do they just let it kind of happen and then try to deal with it? How would you suggest personally, if they're selling, that they approach it? I think you said they don't realize what a flood of emotion it's going to be. But if you're involved in it as an agent or in working, say, with you through this, and they brought you this company, what advice would you give them that might help one to recognize the emotional intensity or deal with it a little bit?
You know, I think the first thing that's probably the most helpful is if you're a seller, think like a buyer. If you're a buyer, think like a seller. So think what the other individual is looking at, and understand that it's okay to have a lot of passion about your business. But it's also very important to do very honest self-examination. If you're in a position to where the block of business, let's just say you're not selling their whole business, just that block of business. If that block of business is distracting from your main focus and is really not the primary thing that you want to focus on to build your business, then it's a smart thing to adjust that focus and have somebody else step in and assist with that, a good partner. The other thing is, if you are transitioning completely out of the business, it is fine to have other individuals step in, because your clients will actually appreciate that. So think about it. If you've spent your whole career making promises to individuals that you're going to take care of them, and you promise your staff different things, you promise your family different things, all of these different people are all involved in all of that. And you having a good plan allows them to relax in what their future holds. So it doesn't leave it as a question mark. There's a quote that I always credit Zig Ziglar with, and I probably use it too much, but it really has it's profound to me, and it's, if you're not replaceable, you're not promotable. And so many people have spent their careers trying to feel like and be irreplaceable. And honestly, that's not what everybody around you needs. It's not that they don't embrace you being there and you're helping, and the things that you do are very, very special. But if you put others in the position to where they can help to continue that on, what you've created, then that is actually protecting their future. And then the last thing I think I'll mention on that, Carol, is that there's also other loving and caring and truly good people in our industry other than yourself. So sometimes you don't feel like that. You don't feel like, well, nobody can take care of my clients. Nobody will care about them as much as I do. And that may be very well true for a lot of people. So you got to be careful who you do business with. But there's a lot of good people out there to also hand that baton on to.
Well, do you find that it is helpful to perhaps write somewhere in the beginning, ask this person, so why are you interested in selling your business? Or why are you interested in buying this business? Because it kind of makes them deal a little bit with their emotional tie to this thing. As you said, they probably start out with some financial thing, but have you found that asking them the why question helps with you realizing what's the emotional direction that this may go?
Yes, that's a beautiful point, Carol. And I think the reason why that is so important to ask that question is because you need to be thinking about what's going to happen after the transaction is completed. Because if you didn't address those emotions and actually make sure that you put that person in a position to where they don't feel like all of a sudden they're just outside looking in, then that's going to surface later. And so that person will end up with buyer's remorse and wanting to try to come back into the business. And then you have issues of, well, what if you created non-compete situations with that, and what kind of complications would that create? So it's very, very important to make sure that whoever's acquiring that business matches up with their objectives with the seller. So yes, it is extremely important for all individuals involved to understand that this is not just a financial transaction. It is a relationship transition from those clients over to somebody else, and it happens to involve finances.
Right. I would think that that might help things move a little bit more smoothly, because it is a little bit introspective to answer that question. So when it comes to the operational processes, what are the keys to a successful transition?
Well, I think you have to, if you haven't already put your organization in a high level of organizational standpoint where you could move that on to somebody else and they could pick up where you left off, then you need to do that now. If you're just starting your company, you need to build that transition into it, because that transition, whether or not it's organic transition or acquisition transition or whatever that transition might be, will happen as time moves forward. So think about the different things that are involved in that. If an individual has to move the principal of the agency from someone else to another individual, if you're trying to move a social security number instead of a tax ID number, that's very, very difficult to do with carriers. So because of that, incorporation becomes extremely important for an individual to incorporate their agency so that that transition can be made much, much simpler. And that way you allow that transition of a tax ID number versus a transition of a social security number. And so from a contracting and everything else standpoint, incorporation becomes important. The second piece is data. If you do not have your files in, if they're just paper files, which is completely fine, by the way. A lot of agents function with paper files and everything, as I'm not demonizing those, but I am saying that more than likely, if somebody acquires your agency, they're going to want that in digital format. And so put it in some kind of a CRM, organize your information in some kind of a CRM, and be able to answer some of the basic questions. Do you know who your clients are? Do you know if they're active or inactive? Do you know what kind of policy information that they have, what carrier they're with, what kind of plan they have, etc.? Some of these things seem pretty basic, but at the same time, they are really what, from an organizational standpoint, happens. And then look at your contracts. Your contracts with the carriers become extremely important for you to audit those contracts and make sure that those contracts are in proper order and that you're actually the principal on them. One of the things from an organizational standpoint that I've seen quite a bit, Carroll, that is concerning is that a lot of agency owners, if you have an agency and you have utilized staff to be the principal on a contract, you may find that as an agency, you don't even own that piece of business that your employee does. I've had W-2 employees actually own the entire blocks of business because the principal of the agency did not want to, like in the Medicare space, they didn't want to do the certifications, or they didn't want to do the different contracting and things like that with them. And so they just allow their staff to do that, which is okay, except for the fact that you've just handed that control and ownership over to that staff member for that piece of business. And also, if that commission is just assigned and they're not actually a sub-agent, but they're actually just assigning their commissions over to you, then a downline agent can unassign those just as quickly as they assigned them. And so those commissions, again, are not owned. So you may go to sell your agency, which I've had one. I had one that they went to sell their agency, and we were in the middle of it, and we found out that this staff individual owned 80% of that agency, literally owned that business. And when that individual found that out during the transaction, the whole dynamics of the agency changed pretty radically for the owner. So looking at those kind of things are very, very important from an organizational standpoint.
So details and details, but they probably fall into certain categories, as you said, like contractual, who's your client in a CRM. Are there ever any contracts with outside vendors that need to be considered instead of just maybe a staff member managing things? I have no idea.
Yeah, when you go into a transaction where somebody is going to take over the relationships for, a certain number of policyholders, anything that impacts them is going to be important. So if you have to look at your carrier contracts, you have to look at the not only the active contracts that you have, but also the inactive ones. You may have inactive carrier contracts and policyholders with those. You may have policyholders that you've stopped earning commissions on, but they're still your clients and you take care of them. So how is that going to be treated in a transaction where somebody's valuing that business? You have every relationship that you can possibly look at from every angle. Like you said, it may be with a carrier, it may be with a vendor, it may be with other individuals, become extremely important. So you have to take a step back, don't assume anything. And then from an organizational standpoint, I strongly recommend that the first thing that you do when you start working with someone, that when you're seriously going to be talking about potentially working together, put a non-disclosure agreement in place immediately. And that way you can start to talk openly. That non-disclosure agreement is just a legal document that makes the other people liable if they shared private information after you disclosed it to them. So you owe that to your clients anyway, to make sure that you have something like that from somebody you're going to talk to. But if you don't have that, you're going to withhold some of that information just because out of apprehension, and maybe you want to tell them later after you know how much they're going to offer. But that's problematic because you can't do the valuation until you actually have that information. And so getting your organization, since that's what we're talking about, that just stepping back, looking at your organization as a whole, how are you doing business? What kind of employee agreements do you have if you have employees? What type of information do you actually have about your business if you're in business, of every level of what you're doing? Pretend like you're buying it, not selling it. And if you do that, then you will realize, hey, listen, maybe I don't necessarily know this piece of information. Okay, find that out, because it is going to surface. And then what are your client relationships like? If you're organized, then you have good client relationships, and better client relationships increase valuations. So that's that person that's purchasing it is looking how they're going to maintain those client relationships. And if you've got them strong because you have a good organizational and system structure in place, then that's going to pass on.
So it sounds as if the timeline for selling your business actually starts organizationally right before you really can approach someone like you, Dan, that the more homework and organization that you do in advance of actually going out and trying to sell or buy a business, it sounds like that's an essential part of moving now to the financial aspect of being a buyer or a seller. So let me just ask you, if it's a small business and there are family members involved, does that sometimes complicate the dynamics of actually being able to go ahead with the financial piece of it? Because some of them have been involved for years, but aren't in a decision-making position, maybe.
Yes, it's again, that honest self-examination is really important. If you're looking to retire and you want to sell, let's just say you want to sell your pasture agency onto your children, or one of your children maybe that has been working in the agency, then that individual is going to have to, if you're selling to them or you're going to retire, you're probably thinking, I'm going to retire on my renewals. And if you retire on your renewals and they're not purchased, by that, then that child that's taking over that business will start taking over the business without the income that was coming into that business. So that means that they're at an immediate disadvantage unless they acquire it from you. If they acquire it from you, then the financing can be a little bit touchy because commissions aren't generally used as an asset that you can borrow against. And so most lenders won't do that. And so because of that, that ends up with a lot of family situations where it's family financing, where the parent finances it so that the child go into business. And that can be really fraught with a lot of danger. Another thing too that happens with that very frequently is professional valuations don't always get done. And because of that, that can cause a lot of issues. I highly recommend that no matter what transaction you're doing, whether it's family or somebody you don't even know, you always use NDAs, you always use professional valuations, and you always use a professional purchase agreement, because you don't want to make assumptions, especially with family, because you want to make sure family stays family, and that can undo if you're not careful. So another thing too that a lot of times people don't think about is, let's just say you have 3 children and one of them has been in the agency working with you for 10 years and the others have never done anything inside the agency. If something happens to you, it's very likely that the other 2 are going to feel like they have an equal share of that business, just like the one that's been there for 10 years. Now, the person that's been there for 10 years probably is not going to feel like that at all. So if they go to acquire that, then you need to be able to address that through professional valuation, so somebody doesn't question how much that was actually worth. What was that inheritance actually worth, and is there agreements in place? One of the biggest financial mistakes most agencies make is depending on the carrier contracts to be the only contractual support inside of that agency that controls all the different relationships with their sub-agents, with their everybody. And so they allow that to take place. If you have children that are working inside of your agency and you think that you're going to potentially pass that on to them, draft up an agreement of what you expect. Make sure that everything is really documented, and don't make assumptions that other people are going to feel this way or other people are going to understand this. They're not. And it's a quick way of having a big family rift in that situation. And by the way, succession planning is very commonly within families. I mean, it's very common, but treat it just exactly like you would any other professional transition. Don't treat it like just another family matter, because it's not. It's business, and you need to treat it like that. And if you do that, the relationships will stay strong. If you don't, you end up with a lot of financial complications and a lot of issues that can haunt you down the road.
Well, how about, are there any items to consider when it does come to staff or say downline agents, if that's involved in your business, which is likely?
Yes. There's very often verbal or implied communications with staff and downline agents of what will happen to them, to the business, if something happens to you. So make sure that those items are clear to you and whoever is acquiring it. If somebody's acquiring that business, they need to understand that if that person is a key person inside that business and they thought it was going to pass on to them, and all of a sudden you're the new owner, there could be a rift there that you don't want, and it can destroy that organization as time moves forward. So make sure that everybody's fully aware of that, and you communicate that to individuals. Those people that work for you are depending on a future just like you are. I mean, they want to make sure that they have a good retirement plan in place and that their future is outlined. It's not completely dependent on you just being there, because if that's the case, then all of a sudden it's going to change. And transition doesn't always happen the way that we want it to. We are in the business of planning for unexpected events in people's lives. Maybe expected when it comes to retirement or something, but definitely unexpected when it comes to serious illnesses or sudden death or something. We are we are people too, and the same thing that can happen to our clients can happen to us. And so you need to think about those people as you go into it. And so, there's a few things that I do want to kind of talk about that I think are critical to the financial part of acquisition. One is the time of year that you go through an acquisition. In individuals who are acquiring a block of business, if it's right before AEP, when it comes to the Medicare space, when it's right before the annual enrollment period, they're going to be very slow to want to value that book of business because they don't know what's going to happen during the annual enrollment period. So if you're in the Medicare space, the best time to discuss and work on transitions of your business come at the first of the year, right after AEP, and after you have the commission statements that come in from your annual enrollment period to show exactly what business stayed on the books. And then before the AEP blackout periods, and carriers have blackout periods, but they won't even allow carrier contract transitions when it gets too close to AEP. But if you're going to go through the process of valuations and the documents and the communications back and forth and everything else, you don't want to push that runway too close to the annual enrollment period. It impacts valuations, impacts transition, and the ability to actually do that. So pay very close attention to that, because the value of your business at different times of year are very, very different based on some of those situations that are unique to the Medicare space. And then have very realistic expectations of the time that is involved with an acquisition and the transition. It's not going to be overnight. It just isn't. It takes time. You're not selling a single agency. You're selling 60 contracts or 50 contracts, how many different carriers you've worked with over all the years, and you have different clients with different companies and different plans, and there's been all these changes. All of those contracts, everything have to be moved over. And so you get involved with all those. And so you're going to have something called assignment of commissions that are going to have to be part of the purchase agreement that an individual signs. And those assignment of commissions have to go to the carriers, and then the carriers have to process those. So there's some time involved with that. So after you've done all your due diligence, you enter into a time where there's a purchase offer. Then if that purchase offer is accepted, then you're going to go into a purchase agreement, make sure all the agreement is the way that everybody wants it. Then you sign those. And part of that is normally the assignment of commissions. And then you also have the agent of record to deal with, so that the new person is actually able to service that book of business. So for some plans and some carriers, the assignment of commissions and assignment of agent of record come together. Some carriers, they're separate. And so you have to make sure that, if you acquire a piece of business, that you can actually take care of the clients too. So both of those have to come over. All of that takes time, realistic expectations and things like that. So look at that closely when you're looking at, the acquisition process, to make sure that you understand kind of what you're getting into. It's not an overnight thing. It's a lot of information going back and forth, which is good for you if you're selling your business, because you want a full understanding of that, and so do they. But it takes time to make all that happen. But it definitely impacts that.
So what exactly is a buyer looking for in terms of profitability? I mean, you get all of this ready. It may or may not be your entire book of business, because I know some agencies will sell off, as you mentioned in the beginning. It may be that they want to move the focus of their business. So they may be keeping some and handing off another part of the business. But what does a buyer look at when they're looking for profitability? You mentioned timing, which I think we can all understand, it's going to change. So is there anything else that they kind of need to see in order to even want to take the next few steps?
Yes, I think usually when you talk with an individual who's selling their business, they will tell you, which rightly so, they will tell you a lot about their past. This is what we made last year. This is what we did, the different things. A buyer is looking at the future. A buyer is saying, okay, that's great, but what is the future? So like on a valuation standpoint, for instance, a lot of times individuals will be looking for, okay, well, what's my multiple of my gross income from last year? They're going to more than likely be looking at multiples of your 12-month projected versus what it was last. Because especially in the senior market, a lot of individuals have a lot of different types of products who have completely different types of values. A Medicare supplement versus Medicare Advantage or PDP or supplementary products and things like that. They all have different methods of valuation. And so they're going to be looked at as individual policies. And so they're not looking at this great big bubble. And so you have to see what the future is going to hold with that. So in looking at that, those individuals are going to, number one, ask and look at your 12-month projected, was half of your income from annuities, who was, already exhausted what you're going to earn off of those. And it may make your income look good last year, but the projected next year is probably not even there, on some of those products. And then they're going to try to weigh out all of those factors and then bump against expenses with that. So if you have a building that you have to maintain the lease on, and the lease is extremely expensive, or if you have extremely high staffing costs that are unusually high staffing costs, they're going to have to factor that against their future profits. And so you're going to, as a buyer, you're going to say, okay, well, this is what it's going to cost us to run this business and keep this continuity the way that it is, because we don't want to break a business that's working. But if we're running the business that way, what is our profitability in addition to that? So if you're getting ready to kind of transition, it's not a time to start adding a lot of staff on and things like that, or maybe spending huge amounts on some of the operational items that may not be the same operational item, that the buyer uses. So you got to watch that, because they're going to see what you've committed to. And you talked to me ago about contracts and commitments. What kind of equipment leasing costs do you have? What's your cost of doing business? And then another thing too to look at is, what kind of a purchase is it? If it's a stock purchase or an asset purchase. If it's a stock purchase and they're buying your entire business, there's a lot of different aspects to that. If it's an asset purchase, which is normal, then they're purchasing the policyholders, and then they'll enter into an agreement to keep some of the staff and things to take care of those policyholders. So they're two separate kind of items that they're looking at as far as cost factors. And then another thing too that they're going to look at is the age of the policy with the carrier, because the age of the policyholder is obviously important because of the mortality, but the age of the policy, in some contracts with carriers, they may only have 6 years of commissions that they pay. And even though your income shows, if they're in the 5th year of that buyer knows that they have 1 more year of commission, even though you've been receiving it for the last 5 years and may not be thinking about that, the buyer will be thinking about that. So they're looking at that runway ahead, and they're going to be asking a lot of questions in regards to that, to see where that policy's at in its life cycle.
That's very helpful, Dan. I noticed that in some of the mergers and acquisitions, the one principal is sometimes obligated to stay on for a year or two, as opposed to other staff in some of these. Is that common in mergers and acquisitions, that they want the person, who may want to retire or move the direction of the business in a different way? Is it common for people to be asked to stay on for X number of months or years in order to make sure that the transition is, in other words, I'm discussing after the actual sale goes through, is part of it that they would remain to make sure that the transition is smooth? Or is it hit and miss?
Well, it really depends on the specific situation, and it just depends on the ability of the buyer. if the buyer has a structure in place that they can put an agent into that role or train an agent quickly into that role, then that's probably not going to be necessary, and sometimes can even be problematic because it's kind of confusing with the clients to see what is actually happening if it's not a clean break, if you will, and that person's transitioning over to another organization. And it also depends on whether or not that agent themselves have made themselves too dependent or too irreplaceable to those clients. If an individual owns an agency, and not everybody has this. I mean, some people just work by themselves, and so that's a totally different animal. But if they have an agency, they should start incorporating other individuals talking to them from that agency. Have other staff members reach out to that client and ask them, different service issues, or just ask them how they're doing, that kind of thing. Have them start communicating with those clients so that they're not just, I only talk to Carroll and that's the only person I want to talk to. Start breaking them of that. That will allow for a quicker transition from that. But if the buyer has the ability, which a good relationship should, to be able to step in and actually keep that continuity without that person, your business really should be built in a way that if something happened to you suddenly and unexpectedly, that you're prepared for it. That somebody could step in and do that. From a convenience standpoint, it definitely helps to help that transition over. In fact, in most purchase agreements, there will be a holdback. In other words, they may pay out 70 or 80% of the offer and hold back 20 or 30% for 6 months or a year, just to make sure that that person who was transitioning out actually helped with that transition in and kept the continuity there. So even if they're not there, it may be something that they're doing in the community. It may be the support through some phone calls or letters to individuals, to make sure that they're introducing them to the new agent, a new owner, that kind of thing. So that I would recommend an individual understand that that's probably going to be what they're going to see. They're going to see a holdback. Sometimes it's tied to policy retention, but most of the time its real purpose is to make sure that that person helps just make sure those relationships stay solid. So it's whatever it takes to keep the relationship solid as the transition happens.
Well, Dan, I think at this point we've talked about the emotional preparedness, and we've certainly heard a great deal about being well prepared, again, organizationally. And now I think you very nicely covered financial preparedness. The theme to me seems that planning ahead, really understanding and using the tips that Dan has given us today could really facilitate, I guess, not only selling or buying a business, but I think, Dan, a good advice that you've given most of us is, as you're a business owner, you need to be thinking about this all along the way. As you said, you have no window to know when you may not be there for the business, or when you may decide the business is something that you want to have acquired. So I want to thank you on behalf of our listening audience here for giving us a very organized way of saying, have I got these 3 pillars in mind as I grow a business, which is so much a part of the person, but as you said, staff dependent, family dependent, and it's a very complicated topic, which you have managed to simplify fairly well for us, in giving us a good send-off in thinking now, early, about what it takes to do a merger and acquisition. So I thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd want to offer to the audience? I think I mentioned that you have your book, Talking Medicare, which I own, and I have certainly been able to look at and find my answers. I know that in the chat box, if there are any questions, Suzanne has listed where you can send your questions. And I guarantee you that we will be getting, Dan, those questions. If you're a member, as Suzanne said, send all your questions to advisortoday@naifa.org, because this is such a personal, complicated in many ways endeavor. We thought it would be better if you had a specific question to get a specific answer from Dan.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I would finish with is, number one, be proud that you are number one in this business. This is an honorable business. Be proud of what you have built, and have pride in the fact that you've built something that can last on beyond you, that carries on your legacy and all of the relationships and everything that you built. It is a real accomplishment to get to a point to where you've built something that can even be acquired. I mean, that's wonderful. And I think that the more that you enjoy that and treasure that, the better off you are. A lot of us, me included, you start selling, and because of your success, you become a business. And then so instead of going into business, and it happens to be in selling, you kind of sell and then you end up in business. The sooner that you embrace that you are in business, and that it needs a business structure, and it needs all of the organizational, everything built around it to be able to be a business and function as a business, even with or without you. I think the quicker you do that, the more you're going to start adding value to that, and recognizing that the carriers that you choose to do business with need to be the right carriers that can continue on that continuity and have a good retention rate and things like that, and that your systems are in place. Thinking like a business individual is so important, but enjoy it. It's not an adversarial. If you're going in with the right buyer, it's not a head-to-head competition. It's two individuals that are working together for the betterment and care of the clients that you have to take care of.
That's perfect. I'm not saying another word other than, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much, Dan, for the education, the insights, and for the honesty of what we can do to be better prepared for a merger and an acquisition. Thanks.